Throughout today's sessions, we've explored how erasure operates in many forms through media bias, the rewriting of history, and the denial of lived experiences. But sometimes erasure isn't just about what's removed, it's about what is invented to replace the truth. One of the most insidious forms of erasure occurs when identities are constructed or manipulated to cover up deeper histories, silencing a people's authentic heritage under the guise of representation. This is the focus of our next presentation, which explores how the invention of a taino identity has been used to erase Boricua identity. While many narratives speak of the Taino people as the indigenous heritage of Puerto Rico, the construction of that identity, particularly in contemporary contexts, has often been obscured more than it has been revealed, raising difficult questions about cultural ownership, authenticity, and the politics of heritage. To guide us through this complex and challenging topic, we're honored to welcome Tanya Rodriguez G, an independent researcher, educator, and advocate who focuses on the pre and post European contact history of Puerto Rico. Tanya G's work is globally recognized for unmasking the layers of identity construction surrounding the Taino community. Her research challenges simplistic narratives and delves into how identity politics, cultural propaganda, and colonial legacies continue to shape Puerto Rican identity today. Tanya Ji was also a valued presenter and ally during the first Understanding Hinduphobia conference back in 2021. And today, Tanya G's presentation will encourage us to think critically about how identity can be weaponized and how invented history can erase, not preserve living traditions. Please join me in welcoming Tanya G.
Thank you, Shikha. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. That was quite the introduction. Today has been absolutely fabulous on so many levels. Um, I would like to start off thanking Sneha, Indu, Sanjeet, the Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies, UT Dallas, all the presenters, all the participants, and all the seekers, and all our ancestors that brought us here together today to bring our words to the greater collective in the spirit of love, compassion, understanding, and healing in humankind. The information I bring you today will challenge or confirm your belief systems about Indigenous heritages in the Caribbean, or as we know, the Antilles, which is the original Indigenous word for the Caribbean, Antilles. Before we begin, I'm going to take a deep breath and clear your mind to give yourself the opportunity to receive this information, receive this presentation with an open mind. And trusting that when truths like this are presented, it can be challenging. Just allow the energy to move through you and offer up the opportunity to shift the challenge from believing unquestioningly in Tainoism and shifting that to challenge Tainoism beyond the books written by Tainoists, supporting Tainoism, promoting Tainoism, and protecting Tainoists from Tainoism being challenged. So the conversations today have been about historically continuous cultures. So I would like to present to you, how do we navigate when a group of people present as a marginalized culture that's completely fabricated? So I'm going to go ahead and screen share and see. So what when we talk about what is a fabricated culture, Tainoism is a fabricated culture that it's a fabricated identity movement that contributes to the homogenization, appropriation, and erasure of diverse Caribbean indigenous cultures, ultimately marginalizing Puerto Ricans and upholding American exceptionalism. That's a lot. It's a lot to digest. So I'd like to open up with everything that you've been sold about the so-called Taino revival, the so-called Taino movement, the reconnecting Indians of Tainos, the Taino existence. It's all a lie. It's all fabricated. Taino identity, so many people claim today, is not a rediscovery of the lost people that were hidden in the mountains in Puerto Rico, an island that's 30 miles wide and 110 miles long. There's a rediscovery of Indian people in the mountains in Puerto Rico that suddenly came out in the 1970s. That instead, rather, that the reality of Tainoism is that it's a modern fabrication designed to homogenize, erase, and manipulate history. Using American exceptionalism as a methodology to erase culture and heritage in the Caribbean. So throughout history, the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and I'll be shifting to Antilles because Caribbean is it's a modern word. Throughout history, the indigenous peoples of the Antilles have been diverse, complex, and varied. It varied from island to island. Each island in the Antilles, in the Greater Antilles, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, Dominican Republic, the USVIs, the BVIs, they're all different individual cultures, island-wide. And in some islands, like the Dominican Republic, there are many different cultures, many different languages. Each island has a different language, and this is all documented in books of first contact. But in recent decades, in the 20th century, a movement has emerged claiming that there is one singular Taino identity, homogenizing and erasing all of those unique and diverse island cultures. One of the really interesting things about that is that Taino isn't authentic. There is no mention of Taino until 1836, when Constantine Samuel Rafinski Schmaltz wrote it in a book. Here's the next slide. Wrote it in a book called The American Nations, and specifically wrote about a language in Haiti. And so he didn't write Taino as a culture. He didn't write Taino as a people. He didn't write Taino as anything other than the first time that Taino, the word, was coined was in 1836. Now, around that time, archaeologists and anthropologists were really well known for making stuff up. And so a lot of cultures were impacted by American exceptionalism viewpoints and perceptions of those cultures. And so things like homogenization of cultures, as in the Taino, and bringing in a blanket terminology or a blanket understanding for many different and diverse cultures. This was something that American anthropologists, American scientists were doing globally. Through 1936 and on, the word Taino snowballed, and a man named Benjamin Irving Bruce got a hold of the idea that there wasn't a lot of Caribbean Antilles history in Yale. So he took it upon himself to go to the Antilles and begin to study the culture and the history and the heritage of the Caribbean Antilles people. Well, he also took the term taino, doubled down on it, and then in the late 70s, around in the early 70s, came out with a book called The Tainos. So today, we'll expose the fabricated origins of tainoism, reveal how tainoism functions as a tool for cultural appropriation, how tainoism functions as a erasure-based organization, and offer the opportunity to examine how tainoism contributes to the erasure of our history and heritage in the Antilles, in the Greater Antilles, while also reinforcing the broader marginalization of Puerto Ricans in America and the diaspora. When people don't know their history, people lose place of belonging. They lose place of that, they lose that belonging, they lose the connection. And what tainoism does is capitalize on that and take advantage of that by introducing a new identity to Puerto Rican people. Specifically, you don't have to be American, you don't have to be Puerto Rican, you can be taino. This creates a bit of an identity crisis. And what we end up seeing is a presentation of pretendians in Indigenous-centered spaces, powwows, political spaces, even the UN. This presents a challenging level of erasure as tainoism grows in our societies. One of the things that happens is it acts upon erasing any heritage that is still left within the Greater Antilles of Indigenous culture. So let's do a little bit of going back. Before Spanish contact, the Antilles was diverse. So when Cristobal Colon, which was his real name, Christopher Columbus, is an Americanized name. So as you can see, American exceptionalism also erased the name of the original person who went to the Antilles in 1492. Please note, there are no Christopher Columbus's diaries. There's no Christopher Columbus's writings. When I went to the archives in Seville, Spain, to find any taino, I could not find one. And they flat out said, there's nothing that exists of Cristobal Colon's writings. The things that are presented as Cristobal Colon's writings today are rewritten versions of Bartolomé de las Casas' book, La Historia de las Indias. And so I just want to let you know that if you start to bring in Christopher Columbus's writings, or somebody says the Chronicles of Christopher Columbus, know that it's just a fabrication and there's nothing like that that actually exists. When Cristobal Colon went to the Caribbean in 1492, he met the Lucayan people in the Bahamas. When Cristobal Colon went in 1493, he brought one of the Lucayan chiefs, which is a cacique, to bring him around the Caribbean to introduce him to all of the different island chiefs to begin to initiate trade. Some people were open to it, some people weren't, and this is according to the books of First Contact. One of the things that American exceptionalism does is it paints Cristobal Colon as a villain, when in reality, Cristobal Colon was an economist and opened up trade within the Caribbean and in the Antilles. Now, that's going to really make a lot of people upset hearing that. Cristobal Colon actually punished his men and got in trouble for it. And so when he punished his men, he got in trouble for it. They sent another guy to be in his place, and he failed miserably. And then they sent Oviedo, and Oviedo was the one that started all of the really horrible things. Cristobal Colon knew that if he started really horrible things, he probably wouldn't be able to trade with the people in the islands. And so that's something that's really important, because when Cristobal Colon was Italian in America, he was a hero. The moment Cristobal Colon became Spanish, he became a criminal. And those same things that are used to marginalize Cristobal Colon today are used to marginalize Latino peoples in the United States. One of the greatest examples of that that we can see is within Indigenous Peoples Day, which I call Hate the Spanish Day, because every year I see more and more people beginning to hate the Spanish, using the same narratives used to admonish Cristobal Colon. So let's go back a little bit towards history. So after 1492 happened, 1493 happened, Oviedo happened, 1500s, the 1600s, there was a lot of mixing. There was a lot of racial mixing. There was a lot of influence. There wasn't just the Spanish that went to the islands in the Caribbean and the Antilles. It was everyone. It was the French. It was the Dutch. It was the Italians. It was the Vatican. It was the Portuguese. It was the Spanish. It was random kingdoms all around Europe that had enough money to go to the New World. And so oftentimes when I hear it was the Spanish that did this, it was the Spanish that did that, there's also a lot that was left out of that conversation, which adds to the shame of people not wanting to be Puerto Rican, not wanting to be American, offering the opportunity for a taino identity to be adopted. So around the 1970s, we have colonization, we have the American invasion of Puerto Rico, and I specifically focus in on Puerto Rico as a Puerto Rican woman, Boricua. I speak for my experience and my bloodlines. In the 1970s, there, along with the Indigenous resurgence movement, tainoism was born out of New Age ideology. So around that time, that New Age ideology, pretendians, people were going into Indigenous ceremonies to protect Indigenous peoples, because until 1978, Indigenous peoples in this country could not practice sacred ceremonies without persecution. And so Tainoists during the Indian resurgence movement were bringing in Native American activists into their homes and promoting and doing all of these things while also stealing the culture. And so eventually Tainoism began to fabricate, began to form in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, attracting people who didn't feel a place of belonging due to the erasure of our culture in the American history books, where we weren't even mentioned. And so one of the things, let me just check the time. Okay. So one of the things that has helped to continue to promote tainoism is in the early 80s, backed by Irving Ruse, we were able to see how the homogenization of tainoism has completely wiped all of the culture out from the Greater Antilles. This is backed by a very sophisticated citation stacking cartel made up of about 5 academics. And as you can see, places like the National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian Museum, all are backers of this citation stacking cartel. When you read, or when one reads a paper about tainoism, there begins to become a pattern. And there begins to become a pattern of specific academics that are listed in the papers, and I call it kissing the ring of tainoism. And so each paper will identify a tainoist or taino organization and will list. Some I've seen even a self-citation. There's so many academics in this group. One of the tainoism papers, I saw somebody self-identify more than 28 times themselves to prove taino-ness. This citation stacking cartel is one of the things that Taino uses to build a wall of misinformation to prevent anybody from questioning Tainoism, when in reality, all anybody has to do is look beyond the 1960s or 1836 to realize that Taino, the word, or Tainoism, the concept, didn't exist before that. So when we see something like Cristobal Colon, so this picture here on the left is from the Virgin of the Navigators, which is in the room where Cristobal Colon first brought to Queen Isabella the things that he had found or were given from his first voyage in the Antilles. Cristobal Colon is the one in yellow. Cristobal Colon in the right picture is Christopher Columbus. As you can see, there's a very different version of who he is in history. This serves as a level of erasure, not only for Spanish people, because this also shows that Spanish people we all come in various different colors. It appears to be not as such. The marginalization of our Spanish heritage really kicked in, and I'm going to flip between our marginalization and Tainoism, so bear with me because they do tie in together. The marginalization of our Spanish heritage really kicked in after the Spanish-American War, 1898. Where Puerto Rico was invaded by the Americans. Capitalizing on the marginalization of our people in Puerto Rico, the Americans began to invite American exceptionalism within the culture of Puerto Rico. It eventually erasing our Boricua heritage, which is what Cristobal Colon, who Cristobal Colon met when he landed in Puerto Rico in 1493. In Puerto Rico specifically, the people, the indigenous people in Puerto Rico identified as Boricua in 1493. In Jamaica, the indigenous people identified as Yamaye. In Cuba, the indigenous people identified as Siboney. In the Dominican Republic, the indigenous people identified all different things because there's so many different tribes and each one was unique. That's all been erased by Taino. In the Bahamas, the Lucayans were the ones who Cristobal Colon met in 1492 and 1493. This level of erasure by Tainoism is so severe that today, if somebody is asked what is the original people of Puerto Rico, the answer will be Taino. So how do we recognize what we're looking at is Tainoism? Well, what I just shared, who were the first people that Columbus met when he arrived in the Caribbean? I actually helped out to participate in that level of erasure by assisting Tainos when I was a Taino. I can be Taino one day and decide not to be Taino the next week. And rewriting a role play with the Zen Education Project that asks the question, who were the first people who Christopher Columbus met when he arrived in the Caribbean? And the answer to that, according to tainoists promoting tainoism, is taino. When in reality, they were Antilles Indians, a part of the Antilles, the Greater Antilles, which is the original indigenous word that has been erased off the map. Taino propaganda comes in many forms. We see taino marketing campaigns. You can see that there's a taino, a fake tribal identification card. There's taino tattoo designs. We have taino t-shirts. We have taino costumes. We have taino art, taino everything. One of the things that we can recognize if it's taino propaganda is simply if it begins with taino. One of the things that tainos like to do is co-opt Native American community sayings, such as, we exist, we survived, our ancestors never disappeared, to present a narrative of uninterrupted continuity, when in reality, the existence of a tribal nation, a legitimate tribal nation, such as tribal nations in North America with historical continuity, with governance that can go back beyond 1900, has not existed in the Caribbean since the 1500s. So the first key to knowing what you're about to read or encounter is taino propaganda, are the words, the taino were the first people Christopher Columbus met when he arrived in the Caribbean. So it's problematic because Christopher Columbus didn't exist. It was Cristobal Colon. And by saying that, he erases all the unique and diverse cultures in the Antilles. And it also allows for American exceptionalism to create a narrative of our history that marginalizes our heritage. So social media campaigns also often depict Taino as a unified culture, despite the historical absence of any such singular identity. And so academia supports Tainoism. Tainoists promote Tainoism, and the target are people in the diaspora that are disconnected, feel a loss of belonging, and are suffering from displacement trauma of a connection to their original culture. This often manifests, Tainoism manifests through cultural appropriation. So we'll have things like, you'll be able to see a Tainoist at a powwow if you go to one where there's a Taino ribbon skirt, or people wearing turkey feather headdresses. There's no turkeys that are native to Puerto Rico. People wearing plain style headdresses with the red paint. Missing murdered Indigenous women, red handprint. And obviously, not entirely sure what that costume is, but it is an attempt at being more Indian. We don't have buckskin that's natural in Puerto Rico, native to Puerto Rico. So as you can see, Tainoism attracts people who find a way to race shift into becoming Native American. Now, I must admit, I was a Tainoist at one point, and I felt that there was something a little off about it. In the last presentation, in the last Understanding Hinduphobia, I was deep into Tainoism, and so I apologize for any harm than I may have brought in misrepresenting myself or my culture. It's a noble savage stereotype that Tainoism really, really markets on, and it's a romanticized Indigenous identity rather than acknowledging the real political struggles of the people in the Antilles and in the Caribbean. Another thing that's important to mention is Taino organizations are all nonprofits. They're not actually legitimate Indigenous tribes. They're Indian enthusiast clubs, Northern Native American Indian enthusiast clubs that profit the tribe itself. And what I mean by tribe is collective of people that is a part of a nonprofit Indigenous enthusiast organization that offers fake Native American identity cards. So, all to say, this is it's okay to doubt what you've been taught to believe. Tainoism is not unique. There's well-documented examples of race shifting and the rise of Cherokee identity, for example. Thousands of Americans with no historical ties to Cherokee have self-identified as Cherokee. Northern Native Americans today have been putting forward more and more and more information, pushing back against individuals who choose to self-identify with no actual connection or lineage to a tribe. With tainoists will base the self-identification claim on a DNA bloodline with no lived experience as a Native person, with no names of anybody that was Native, with no growing up Native, with no connection to Native other than one day somebody telling them that they're a taino. The Native DNA that tainoists claim have about 1 million people in between. So to claim and to a self-identity of taino with 1 million people between that one Indigenous ancestor can give all of you maybe a little bit of insight as to how detrimental it is to play Indian using taino to race shift while erasing our culture and heritage in the Antilles, specifically Puerto Rico. So when we see tainos presenting themselves as taino, I want to invite you to advocate for historical accuracy, to go ask a person to go beyond the 1960s to give you any proof. There's a song called Ana Koana by Hector Lavoe that was recorded in 1971. He doesn't mention taino. That is a really great tool to use when bringing in the realities of tainoism. Challenge taino propaganda. If you see something about Puerto Rico and you see taino, say, hey, how come this isn't Boricua? And then also support real Indigenous Antilles history, Puerto Rican history, without falling for the myth of the unbroken taino lineage. I run a page called Taino Leadership Summit. It was an actual event that we did. There's a website, Taino Leadership Summit, and there's a Facebook page, Taino Leadership Summit. It's a resource page for anybody that wants to know about Antilles heritage outside the Taino propaganda machine. I bring empirical evidence sourced back all the way to first contact and continue to learn more as I uncover truths about tainoism. If we don't challenge this false history, we allow American exceptionalism to dictate who we are, and that is the true erasure. So I'd like to thank all of you today. Not sure I went a little bit longer. And also, I am grateful for this opportunity to share these things and would encourage all of you to be brave enough to teach the history they are trying to erase. Thank you very much for your time today. And once again, I'm honored and have a wonderful day.
Dhanyavad, Tanya ji, for that eye-opening and thought-provoking presentation. Erasure doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it takes the form of invented narratives that claim to honor a people's heritage while actually covering it up. What we heard today is a powerful reminder that identity is complex, political, and often shaped by forces far beyond the communities themselves. The construction of a Taino identity to erase Boricua heritage is a stark example of how colonialism and modern identity politics can intersect to distort the truth, leaving people disconnected from their real history. This isn't just a Puerto Rican story, it's a global one. Around the world, we see how dominant systems redefine Indigenous identities for convenience, for tourism, for politics, anything but truth. Tanya ji, your work challenges us to look beyond surface level narratives and ask, who benefits from this version of history? Who gets to define identity? And most importantly, whose voices are being silenced in the process? Let's give another round of appreciation to Tanya Rodriguez ji for her courage, insight, and dedication to uncovering the truth. Throughout